In the spring of 208 BC, a 25-year-old Roman commander with 8,000 exhausted, half-starved soldiers faced 20,000 Iberian warriors backed by Carthage's finest generals. 6 months earlier, this same Roman had nearly died in a mutiny. Now he was about to rewrite the rules of ancient warfare. Think about those numbers for a second. 8,000 against 20,000. That's a 2.5 to 1 disadvantage. The survivors of mutiny, disease, and Rome's darkest hour in Spain, facing an enemy that had never lost on Iberian soil. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how Publius Cornelius Scipio achieved what Roman generals twice his age said was impossible. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see ancient warfare forever. First, the terrain trap that turned Hasdrubal's defensive advantage into a killing field. Second, why Carthage's elite African veterans fled without engaging Rome's exhausted legionaries. And third, the pursuit decision that saved or doomed the Roman Republic. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did soldiers who'd mutinied 6 months earlier fight with suicidal discipline? What innovation did Scipio deploy that terrified seasoned Carthaginian commanders? Why did Hasdrubal abandon 20,000 men to save himself? How did this single battle in a Spanish valley determine whether Hannibal would conquer Rome? To understand how 8,000 survivors destroyed Carthage's grip on Iberia, we need to step back to when Rome's Spanish legions were on the verge of total collapse. 6 months before Baecula, Publius Cornelius Scipio stood in the center of a military camp outside Tarraco and watched 8,000 Roman soldiers debate whether to kill him. He was 24 years old, untested in independent command, and facing the worst military crisis in Rome's Spanish campaign. His father and uncle, Rome's greatest generals in Iberia, had been ambushed and killed 3 years earlier. Their armies had been annihilated. The survivors, these 8,000 men, had mutinied twice, murdered their commanders, and were now being asked to trust a boy barely old enough to hold Imperium. The camp was a powder keg, and Scipio was standing in the center holding a torch. The first mutiny had erupted in 206 BC at Sucro. 8,000 legionaries, unpaid for months, watching Carthaginian armies maneuver freely across territory their commanders had died defending, decided they'd had enough. They murdered their tribunes, not in battle, in their tents. 35 officers killed in a single night. The survivors fled north to Tarraco, carrying stories that made the Senate's blood run cold. Roman discipline, the foundation of military supremacy for 3 centuries, had collapsed in Spain. Here's what the official histories don't tell you. The mutineers had legitimate grievances. They hadn't been paid in 18 months. Supply shipments from Italy had stopped. Half the men were sick with dysentery. They'd watched 2 proconsuls and their entire officer corps get slaughtered in poorly planned campaigns. When Rome sent Scipio, a boy who'd never commanded an independent legion, the camp exploded again. Veterans with 15 years' service were being asked to follow a senator's son whose greatest achievement was surviving Cannae. The odds of Scipio leaving that camp alive were worse than the odds he'd face at Baecula. But Scipio understood something the Senate didn't. These men weren't cowards. They were survivors. They'd lived through military disasters that would have broken professional armies. They didn't need speeches about Roman glory. They needed a commander who understood what they'd endured and had a plan to win. Scipio walked into that assembly unarmed. No bodyguards, no lictors. Just a 24-year-old commander facing 8,000 men who'd murdered the last officer stupid enough to give them orders. According to Polybius, Scipio spoke for less than 15 minutes. He acknowledged their suffering. He promised back pay from his family's personal fortune. And then he said something that changed everything. He told them he would win. Not eventually. Not with reinforcements from Rome. Now, with them. Within 1 year, they would capture Carthage's capital in Iberia, or he would resign his command. Think about that promise for a second. New Carthage was 300 miles away, garrisoned by 1,000 professional soldiers, supplied for year-long sieges, and protected by walls that hadn't been breached in 2 centuries. Scipio was promising to take it with an army that couldn't pay itself. The mutineers didn't cheer. They didn't pledge loyalty. They simply watched as Scipio turned and walked away, gambling his life that they wouldn't stab him in the back. What happened in the next 12 months would prove that sometimes the most dangerous military asset isn't numbers or weapons. It's soldiers who have nothing left to lose and a commander crazy enough to give them something to win. While Rome's Spanish legions collapsed into chaos, Carthage controlled nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula. 3 Carthaginian armies operated independently across the region. Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's younger brother, commanded the northern forces. Hasdrubal Gisco held the south. Mago Barca secured the interior. Together, they commanded over 70,000 troops, Carthaginian professionals, Iberian allies, Numidian cavalry, and Balearic slingers whose lead bullets could crack a skull at 100 yards. They controlled the silver mines that funded Hannibal's war in Italy. They controlled the ports that connected Carthage to its empire. They controlled everything except one fortified Roman city on the coast, and they were preparing to take that too. Let those numbers sink in for a moment. 70,000 troops versus Rome's 8,000 mutineers. That's nearly a 9-to-1 advantage. But here's what made Carthage's position truly dominant. Geographic separation. Hasdrubal Barca operated 200 miles north of Hasdrubal Gisco. Mago's forces patrolled the central highlands. If Rome attacked any single Carthaginian army, the other 2 could converge and crush them. It was strategic chess on a continental scale, and Carthage held every piece that mattered. The silver mines alone represented an existential threat to Rome. The mines at Castulo produced over 300 pounds of silver daily. That's 9,000 pounds per month flowing directly into Carthaginian military coffers. Every denarius funded mercenaries in Italy. Every ingot paid for Numidian horsemen who'd shattered Roman cavalry at Cannae. Hannibal's army didn't need supply lines from Africa. Spanish silver kept it fed, armed, and lethal. Cut that silver flow, and Hannibal's war machine would grind to bankruptcy within a year. The ports presented an equally critical vulnerability. Carthaginian supply ships sailed freely from New Carthage to Africa to Italy, forming a maritime supply network that connected 3 continents. Reinforcements, weapons, money, intelligence reports, all flowed through harbors Rome couldn't touch. The Carthaginian navy patrolled the Spanish coast with impunity. Roman ships that ventured south of Tarraco simply disappeared. Here's what military historians rarely emphasize. Carthage wasn't just winning in Iberia. They'd already won. The strategic architecture was complete. 3 mutually supporting armies, economic resources that dwarfed Rome's Spanish income, naval supremacy, alliance networks with every significant Iberian tribe. When Scipio's father and uncle launched their desperate offensive in 211 BC, trying to break this system, they walked into a coordinated trap. Both armies were destroyed within days of each other. 40,000 Roman soldiers dead, 2 proconsuls killed. An entire strategic generation of Roman leadership in Iberia annihilated. By 210 BC, when Scipio arrived, Carthage wasn't preparing to conquer Rome's last Spanish foothold. They were deciding whether it was worth the effort. Tarraco would fall eventually through starvation or siege or simple abandonment. Why waste soldiers on an inevitable collapse? But Carthage made one catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed Rome's surviving 8,000 mutineers represented Rome's last desperate gasp in Iberia. They were actually watching the formation of the most dangerous Roman army since the Punic Wars began, led by a commander who'd studied Hannibal's methods and was about to use them to dismantle Carthage's empire piece by piece. In 209 BC, Scipio did something no one expected. He marched 8,000 men 300 miles south and besieged New Carthage, the capital of Carthaginian Iberia. The city was supposed to be impregnable. Walls 40 feet high, a garrison of 1,000 professionals, supplies for a year-long siege. The nearest Carthaginian relief army was 10 days away. Scipio calculated he had 7 days before reinforcements arrived. He took the city in 1 day. Using intelligence from local fishermen, he discovered that at low tide, the northern lagoon became wadable. While his main force attacked the gates in a frontal assault, a hand-picked unit waded across the lagoon and scaled the undefended northern wall. New Carthage fell before sunset. Scipio captured 10,000 prisoners, the entire Carthaginian treasury in Iberia, and most importantly, the psychological initiative. Think about the audacity of that march. 300 miles through hostile territory with no supply train, no siege equipment, and no reinforcements. If Scipio failed, his entire army would be trapped against fortified walls with 3 Carthaginian armies converging from 3 directions. His 8,000 men would be annihilated, and Rome's last presence in Iberia would vanish. Every Roman officer advised against it. Scipio ordered the march anyway. Here's what the ancient sources don't emphasize. Scipio's intelligence network was extraordinary. He'd spent months cultivating relationships with Spanish fishermen, traders, and tribal scouts who hated Carthaginian occupation. One fisherman revealed the lagoon's tidal pattern. At precisely 4 o'clock every afternoon, the northern lagoon dropped to waist depth for approximately 90 minutes. The Carthaginians knew this, but considered it irrelevant. The northern wall rose directly from the lagoon. No one could scale 40 feet of smooth stone while standing in water. Scipio selected 500 men who could swim and climb. They would prove everyone wrong. The assault began at dawn on the 7th day. Roman siege ladders slammed against the eastern gates. Defenders rushed to repel the attack, concentrating forces where Romans appeared strongest. At 4 o'clock, as the tide dropped, 500 legionaries waded into the lagoon, carrying scaling ladders and ropes. The water was cold, the current treacherous. 3 men drowned under the weight of their equipment. The rest reached the northern wall undetected. Climbing wet stone while wearing armor should have been impossible. The first man up, a centurion named Sextus Digidius, fell twice before jamming his pilum into a mortar crack and using it as a handhold. Behind him, 499 soldiers followed. By the time Carthaginian defenders realized what was happening, Romans were pouring over the northern ramparts, attacking the gate defenses from behind. The gates opened at 5:15 p.m. 8,000 Romans flooded into New Carthage. The garrison surrendered within 30 minutes. Scipio stood in the city's central plaza before sunset, surrounded by enough captured gold and silver to pay his army for 3 years. But the real prize wasn't metal. It was the message. Rome had just announced that Carthage's Spanish Empire was no longer safe. And Hasdrubal Barca, watching from 200 miles north, understood exactly what that meant. After New Carthage, Scipio did something that shocked even his own officers. He released Iberian hostages without ransom. He treated captured Carthaginian civilians with dignity. He returned a beautiful hostage to her Iberian chieftain fiancé untouched, along with the gold her family had offered as ransom. Word spread across Iberia that the Romans were different now. Tribes that had fought for Carthage for decades began sending envoys. The 8,000 mutineers who had nearly killed their commanders 12 months earlier now followed Scipio with fanatical discipline. They had seen their boy general do the impossible. They had captured a fortified capital in one day. They had taken more gold in a single siege than they'd earned in 5 years. They believed he was fortune's favorite. They would prove it at Baecula. The numbers behind Scipio's clemency strategy were staggering. New Carthage held 300 Iberian hostages, sons and daughters of tribal chieftains held as insurance against rebellion. Standard Roman practice dictated selling them as slaves. The profit would have been substantial, perhaps 200,000 denarii. Scipio released all 300 without demanding a single coin. Within 6 weeks, 23 Iberian tribes switched allegiance from Carthage to Rome. Think about that strategic return. Scipio sacrificed immediate wealth for long-term alliance networks that would deliver thousands of auxiliary troops, intelligence on Carthaginian movements, and denial of recruitment grounds to his enemies. Here's what made this transformation remarkable. These weren't fresh legions arriving from Italy with traditional Roman discipline. These were the same soldiers who'd murdered their tribunes 18 months earlier. But Scipio had given them something previous commanders never had: victory, wealth, purpose. After New Carthage, every man in that army received triple-back pay from the captured treasury. They weren't fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for a commander who won and paid his debts. The training regimen Scipio implemented during winter 209 BC became legendary. Daily weapons drills, forced marches with full equipment, mock battles using wooden swords to prevent injuries. He organized the legion into smaller, more flexible units that could maneuver independently. He integrated Iberian auxiliaries who understood local terrain. He drilled his men on rapid deployment tactics, the ability to move from marching column to battle formation in minutes rather than hours. By spring 208 BC, Scipio commanded the most dangerous army Rome had fielded in Iberia since the war began. 8,000 legionaries who moved like veterans because they were veterans. They'd survived mutiny, starvation, and the capture of an impregnable city. They'd been tested in ways that parade ground soldiers never experience. And they'd discovered something intoxicating. Under the right commander, they were unstoppable. When scouts reported that Hasdrubal Barca was gathering forces for the march to Italy, Scipio's officers asked if they should fortify and wait for reinforcements. Scipio's response became famous among the army. "We don't wait for Hasdrubal. We hunt him." The mutineers who nearly destroyed Rome's Spanish campaign were about to save it. Hasdrubal Barca received his orders from Carthage in the winter of 208 BC march to Italy. Reinforce your brother Hannibal. Break Rome once and for all. It was the moment Carthage had been planning for 6 years. 2 Barca brothers, 2 armies, converging on Rome from opposite directions. It should have been unstoppable. There was one problem. Scipio and his 8,000 Romans were between Hasdrubal and the Pyrenees. Hasdrubal commanded 25,000 troops, Carthaginian veterans, Iberian warriors, cavalry that could ride down anything on the peninsula. He could crush Scipio's force, secure his supply lines, then march to Italy in triumph. Or he could avoid battle entirely, march north immediately, and let Scipio waste himself besieging Carthaginian cities while Hasdrubal joined Hannibal and ended the war. He chose compromise. He would take a defensive position, force Scipio to attack uphill into fortified positions, bleed the Romans, then continue north. It was the logical choice. It was also the choice that would destroy him. Here's what made Hasdrubal's decision so agonizing. Time. Every day spent in Iberia was another day Hannibal fought alone in Italy against converging Roman armies. Hasdrubal's brother had been campaigning for 13 years without strategic reinforcement. His army was aging. His Gallic allies were unreliable. His supply situation deteriorated annually. Hannibal needed relief immediately, not in 6 months after Hasdrubal finished securing Spain. But destroying Scipio offered undeniable advantages. Hasdrubal commanded a 3-to-1 numerical superiority. His Numidian cavalry had never lost to Roman horsemen. His Iberian infantry knew the terrain. If he committed to battle and won, the march to Italy would be unopposed. He could strip Spain of troops, bringing 40,000 men to reinforce Hannibal instead of 25,000. The combined Barca armies would field nearly 70,000 veterans. Rome couldn't match those numbers. The math was seductive, but dangerous. What if Scipio won? The boy had captured New Carthage in a day using tactics no one anticipated. He turned mutineers into fanatics. He fought like Hannibal, using deception and speed instead of traditional Roman grinding frontal assaults. Losing to Scipio meant losing the army Hannibal desperately needed. It meant abandoning Carthage's entire Iberian empire. It meant strategic catastrophe. Hasdrubal's compromise reflected the paralysis of competing imperatives. Accept battle but minimize risk. Choose terrain that favored defense. Force Scipio to attack uphill into prepared positions. Inflict casualties. Break Roman morale. Then withdraw in good order and continue the march. It was strategically sound, tactically conservative, completely rational. It was also exactly what Scipio wanted him to do. Because Hasdrubal had just made the same mistake every commander who faced Hannibal made. He assumed defensive positions guaranteed victory. He assumed terrain advantages were permanent. He assumed his enemy would fight the battle Hasdrubal planned instead of the battle Scipio would create. In the spring of 208 BC, at a place called Baecula, Hasdrubal would learn that assumptions kill armies. And the student of Hannibal was about to teach Carthage a lesson it would never forget. Hasdrubal positioned his army on a plateau above the Baecula Valley in the spring of 208 BC. The position was tactically brilliant. The plateau rose steeply from the valley floor, creating a natural amphitheater of death for any attacking force. Hasdrubal placed his Iberian allies, 20,000 strong, on the high ground. Behind them, on an even higher ridge, he positioned his 8,000 Carthaginian and African veterans, the core of his army. Light infantry screened the slopes. Cavalry held the flanks. Any army attacking up that slope would be climbing under constant missile fire, exhausted when they reached the Iberians. And if by some miracle they broke through, they would then face fresh Carthaginian professionals on even higher ground. It was fortress warfare, without walls. Scipio looked at that position and saw exactly what Hasdrubal wanted him to see. An impregnable defense, which meant Scipio had to attack it immediately. The slope gradient tells the story. The eastern approach rose at a 40-degree angle for 300 yards. Think about climbing that distance in full armor, carrying a shield, while slingers and archers fire down on you from prepared positions. Roman legionary equipment weighed 60 pounds. Climbing that slope under fire would exhaust professional soldiers before they even reached enemy lines. Hasdrubal had calculated that any assault would lose 20% of its strength to missiles and exhaustion before closing to sword range. Here's where Hasdrubal's tactical genius revealed itself. the double-tiered defense. Even if Romans somehow broke through the 20,000 Iberians on the first plateau, they would then have to climb another 100 vertical feet to engage the Carthaginian veterans. Tired, bloodied, disorganized troops attacking fresh professionals fighting downhill. It was mathematical slaughter dressed as strategy. Scipio's scouts reported these details back to the Roman camp. His officers saw the same conclusions Hasdrubal intended. Frontal assault would be suicide. Siege would take weeks they didn't have. Withdrawal would surrender the initiative and allow Hasdrubal to march unopposed to Italy. Every conventional option led to defeat. But Scipio had studied under the greatest military mind of the age, even if that mind belonged to his enemy. Hannibal had taught him at Trebia, at Trasimene, at Cannae, that the enemy's strength becomes their weakness when you change the terms of engagement. Hasdrubal had built a fortress designed to repel frontal assault. Scipio would attack from 3 directions simultaneously. The plateau's flanks were less steep, more gradual, easier to climb. Undefended because Hasdrubal assumed no commander would divide his inferior force. At dawn on the day of battle, Scipio addressed his 8,000 legionaries. According to Polybius, he pointed at the plateau and said something that became legend in the Roman army. Hasdrubal thinks those slopes protect him. By sunset, they'll be his cage. What happened in the next 6 hours would validate every decision Scipio had made since arriving in Iberia and prove that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't steel. It's understanding exactly how your enemy thinks. Scipio didn't give Hasdrubal time to settle. The Romans arrived in the Baecula valley and immediately prepared for assault. No siege camp, no negotiations, no delay. Hasdrubal watched from the plateau and couldn't understand what he was seeing. Attacking uphill into a fortified position with inferior numbers wasn't bold. It was suicide. But Scipio wasn't planning a conventional assault. He had learned from Hannibal that the fastest way to destroy an enemy wasn't to defeat their army. It was to make their position meaningless. While Hasdrubal's scouts reported Romans preparing for a frontal assault, Scipio divided his force into 3 elements. The center would attack up the middle, fixing Hasdrubal's attention and forces. 2 flanking columns, moving fast and light, would race up the gentler slopes on both sides of the plateau. If they could reach the high ground before Hasdrubal repositioned, they would turn his fortress into a trap. The force distribution was calculated with surgical precision. 2,000 Romans in the center, 3,000 on each flank. Scipio kept the center deliberately weak, just strong enough to engage and hold Hasdrubal's attention, not strong enough to threaten a breakthrough. The flanking columns stripped off heavy equipment. No siege ladders, no baggage train. Just shields, swords, javelins, and speed. They would climb the gentler 20-degree slopes on the plateau's edges, while Hasdrubal's 20,000 Iberians stared straight ahead at the center assault. Here's what made this tactic revolutionary. Scipio was gambling that Hasdrubal would think like a traditional commander. Traditional doctrine said you never divide an inferior force. You concentrate strength at one point and smash through. Hasdrubal expected that. His entire defensive position assumed it. The flanking slopes were undefended precisely because no sane commander would split 8,000 men into 3 pieces when facing 25,000. But Scipio had watched Hannibal divide forces at Trebia, at Trasimene, at Cannae. He'd seen how simultaneous attacks from multiple directions created psychological paralysis. Defenders couldn't reinforce everywhere at once. Momentum fractured, cohesion collapsed. The army that reacted fastest won. And Carthaginian armies, despite their tactical brilliance, were coalition forces. Iberians, Africans, Numidians, all fighting together, but not integrated with the seamless discipline of Roman legions. The timing window was brutally narrow. Scipio's flanking columns needed approximately 45 minutes to reach the plateau's flanks. During those 45 minutes, the center had to hold Hasdrubal's attention completely. If Carthaginian scouts spotted the flanking maneuver, Hasdrubal could reposition his 20,000 Iberians before Romans reached the high ground. The element of surprise would evaporate. The three-pronged attack would become three isolated massacres. Scipio watched the sun climb over the eastern ridge. At precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, he gave the order. Roman war horns blasted across the valley. 8,000 men who'd been mutineers 14 months earlier began moving with precision that would have impressed any parade ground inspector. What happened in the next hour would determine whether Hannibal received reinforcements or whether Carthage's Iberian Empire died on a Spanish plateau. At dawn, Scipio's light infantry began the assault. Velites, young Roman skirmishers armed with javelins, charged up the central slope toward the Iberian positions. Hasdrubal's light troops met them with a storm of javelins, sling bullets, and arrows. Men fell screaming. Bodies rolled back down the slope. The Romans kept climbing. This was the anvil, the force designed to absorb punishment and hold Hasdrubal's attention while the hammers moved into position. The fighting was vicious and close. Velites and Iberian skirmishers clashed with stabbing spears and short swords. Blood slicked the rocks. The noise was overwhelming. And through it all, on both flanks, two columns of heavy infantry were climbing unopposed toward positions that would decide the battle. Hasdrubal saw them too late. The casualties in that first hour were staggering. Balearic slingers fired lead bullets at velocities approaching 100 miles per hour. A direct hit shattered skulls, broke ribs, pulverized organs through armor. Roman velites dropped by the dozens. By 8:30 a.m., approximately 300 Romans lay dead or wounded on the slope. That's 15% casualties in 30 minutes. Think about that attrition rate. At that pace, the center assault would be annihilated before noon. But the center wasn't supposed to win. It was supposed to die slowly enough that Hasdrubal never looked away. And it worked. Hasdrubal stood on the high ridge, watching 2,000 Romans throw themselves against his light infantry screen. He saw determination. He saw courage. He saw exactly what he expected to see. Romans fighting the battle he'd prepared for. His 20,000 Iberians remained in position, facing forward, waiting for the velites to exhaust themselves so heavy infantry could be slaughtered climbing into prepared defenses. At 9:15 a.m., a Carthaginian cavalry scout galloped to Hasdrubal's command position with news that should have been impossible. Roman heavy infantry on both flanks, 3,000 on the left, 3,000 on the right, already halfway up the gentler slopes. Weapons ready, moving fast. Hasdrubal's tactical genius pivoted instantly to tactical paralysis. He'd built his defense assuming a concentrated assault. Now he faced 3 separate attacks simultaneously. If he shifted Iberians to counter the flanks, the center would break through against weakened lines. If he held position, 6,000 Romans would reach the plateau's flanks unopposed and attack his main line from 3 directions. There was no good option, just degrees of catastrophe. Here's what the ancient sources barely emphasize. Hasdrubal had approximately 12 minutes to reposition 20,000 men before Roman flanking columns reached combat range. 12 minutes to reorganize tribal warriors who spoke different languages, followed different commanders, and had never drilled for simultaneous multi-directional defense. It was tactically impossible, and Scipio had known it would be. The trap wasn't the terrain, it was time itself, and Hasdrubal had just run out. By mid-morning, Scipio's flanking columns reached the plateau. Suddenly, Hasdrubal's fortress had enemy soldiers on 3 sides. The Iberian warriors who had been facing downhill, protected by their elevated position, now had Roman legionaries attacking from their flanks, where the slope was gentle and the advantage minimal. The psychology of the battlefield inverted in seconds. Defenders became surrounded. High ground became a box. Hasdrubal ordered his Iberians to refuse their flanks, to wheel their formations 90 degrees and meet the Roman threat. It was the right order. It was also impossible to execute under combat conditions with 20,000 men spread across a plateau. Formations fragmented. Gaps opened, and into those gaps poured Roman heavy infantry who had trained for exactly this moment. At 9:45 a.m., the first Roman gladius found Iberian flesh on the eastern flank. Within minutes, 3,000 legionaries were engaged in close quarters combat with warriors who'd been facing the wrong direction 30 seconds earlier. The Iberians were veteran fighters, skilled with falcata swords and oval shields. But they were fighting as individuals, not formations. Romans moved in synchronized units, 3 men covering each other's flanks, rotating wounded soldiers to the rear. Maintaining momentum. Here's where Scipio's winter training paid catastrophic dividends for Carthage. Roman legionaries had drilled this exact scenario. Attack disorganized enemies from advantageous angles. Maintain formation cohesion during rapid advances. Exploit gaps ruthlessly. The Iberians were brave. They were experienced. But courage without organization is just spectacular dying. And the plateau was becoming a killing floor. The western flank collapsed first. 3,000 Romans hit. Iberian positions at 9:50 a.m. and by 10:15 a.m. had driven completely through the enemy line. Think about that timeline. 25 minutes to shatter a defensive position that should have held for hours. Iberian warriors broke into small groups, fighting desperately, trying to reform, dying in clusters as Roman wedge formations punched through resistance like hammers through pottery. Hasdrubal watches his carefully constructed defense disintegrate. 20,000 Iberians. His shield, his buffer, the force meant to bleed Romans before they ever reached his African veterans, are fragmenting across the plateau. Casualties are approaching 2,000 in less than an hour. Entire tribal contingents are routing. The center, still holding against the original Roman assault, suddenly has enemies attacking from behind. The tactical brilliance of Hasdrubal's position has become its death sentence. The plateau that protected his army from frontal assault now traps it between converging Roman columns. Retreat means climbing down steep slopes while under attack. Standing means fighting from 3 directions simultaneously. Every advantage has inverted into nightmare. At 10:30 a.m., Hasdrubal makes the decision that will haunt military historians for 2 millennia. He orders his 8,000 Carthaginian and African veterans, still fresh, still positioned on the highest ridge, to prepare for withdrawal. Not counterattack, not reinforcement, withdrawal. He's abandoning 20,000 allies to save his mission. What happens in the next 60 seconds will determine whether that decision was strategic genius or unforgivable betrayal. The Iberian line disintegrated. Not slowly, not gradually. It shattered like dropped pottery. Warriors who had fought Rome for a decade suddenly found themselves attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. Cohesion collapsed. Individual combat devolved into panic. Men threw down their shields and ran. The Romans, pursued with systematic brutality, Legionaries worked in pairs and trios, cutting down fleeing warriors with mechanical efficiency. This wasn't battle anymore. This was execution. Hasdrubal watched his forward army dissolve in less than an hour. 20,000 Iberians, veteran warriors who knew this terrain, who had defended this exact position successfully against previous Roman attacks, were routed by 8,000 exhausted legionaries using nothing but speed and geometry. The casualty numbers from the rout tell a story of systematic slaughter. Roman sources, confirmed by Carthaginian accounts, suggest that between 8,000 and 10,000 Iberians died in the first 2 hours after the line broke. That's approximately 400 deaths per minute at peak killing tempo. Think about that rate. Modern combat rarely achieves such concentrated lethality. Ancient warfare, when formations held, was brutal, but relatively controlled. But when formations collapsed, when soldiers turned their backs and ran, killing became industrial. Here's what military historians emphasize about ancient roots. The deadliest moment wasn't the fighting, it was the fleeing. A warrior facing forward with shield raised and sword ready was dangerous even to superior opponents. A warrior running with his back exposed was target practice. Roman gladio were designed for stabbing, perfect for driving into unprotected backs and kidneys. Legionaries trained to recognize the signs of breaking morale, to press attacks the instant cohesion wavered, to transform tactical advantage into total annihilation. The plateau became a butcher's floor. Iberian warriors threw down weapons, trying to run faster. Some attempted surrender. Roman soldiers killed them anyway. This wasn't cruelty. This was doctrine. Scipio's orders were explicit. No quarter until organized resistance ceased completely. Every enemy soldier who escaped today could fight tomorrow. Better to end it now. Tribal chiefs who'd led their men into battle watched their warriors cut down in hundreds. Some tried to rally defensive positions. Roman formations overwhelmed them in minutes. Others fled toward the Carthaginian veterans on the high ridge, hoping Hasdrubal would counterattack and save them. Hasdrubal's veterans stood in perfect formation, shields locked, watching Iberians die. And they didn't move. By 11:30 a.m., organized Iberian resistance had ceased. Scattered groups still fought, surrounded and desperate. But the army had stopped existing as a coherent force. The plateau that had been Hasdrubal's fortress was now covered with thousands of bodies. Roman soldiers standing among them, breathing hard, and the Carthaginian general facing a choice that would echo through history. Save his allies or save his mission. He'd already decided. Now came the hardest part, making his veterans obey. Hasdrubal Barca stood on the highest ridge at Baecula and faced the decision that would define his legacy. His Iberian allies were destroyed. His forward position was overrun. Roman legionaries were advancing toward his 8,000 Carthaginian veterans, the core of his army, the professionals he needed for the march to Italy. He could commit them now. Counterattack, use the high ground he still controlled. His veterans against exhausted Romans. He might win. He might destroy Scipio's entire force. But he might also lose everything. If his African corps broke, if the Romans won, the march to Italy would be impossible. Hannibal would never receive reinforcements. Carthage would lose Iberia and probably the war. Hasdrubal made his choice. He ordered retreat. The African veterans would withdraw immediately, preserving the core of the army for the mission that mattered. The Iberians were expendable. The mission was not. The mathematics of his decision were brutal but clear. 8,000 Carthaginian veterans represented 6 years of training, recruitment costs exceeding 2 million denarii. and the operational corps needed to cross the Alps and reinforce Hannibal. 20,000 Iberians could be replaced within months through tribal levies. The veterans could not. Hasdrubal was sacrificing the replaceable to preserve the irreplaceable. Strategically, it was flawless. Morally, it was monstrous. Here's what the Carthaginian sources tried to obscure. Hasdrubal's officers protested. African centurions argued for counterattack. They commanded fresh troops on high ground against exhausted Romans scattered across the plateau. They could win. They had the numbers, 8,000 veterans against perhaps 6,000 effective Roman legionaries after casualties. But Hasdrubal understood what his subordinates didn't. Winning the battle risked losing the war. At 11:45 a.m., Hasdrubal gave the order. Full withdrawal, north, immediately. Formation marching. The Carthaginian veterans began moving in perfect discipline. Shields locked, rear guard facing the Romans, a textbook tactical retreat. Below them on the plateau, surviving Iberians watched their Carthaginian allies abandon them. Some screamed a betrayal. Others simply stared, comprehending their death sentences. The withdrawal exposed Carthaginian military doctrine at its most cynical. Coalition armies were disposable. African and Carthaginian professionals were sacred. Hasdrubal had commanded these Iberians for 2 years, fought beside them, promised them victory and glory. Now he left them to die because they served a function he no longer needed. The shield had broken. The mission demanded he preserve the sword. Scipio watched the Carthaginian withdrawal from the plateau's eastern edge. His officers urged immediate pursuit. Destroy Hasdrubal's veterans. End the threat completely. But Scipio calculated differently. His legionaries were exhausted. The Carthaginians were withdrawing in good order, dangerous prey. Pursuing into unknown terrain could turn victory into disaster. And he'd already won what mattered: the battlefield, the supplies, the psychological dominance, and something far more valuable than dead Carthaginians. He'd proven that Hannibal's brother could be beaten. That knowledge would spread faster than any army could march. Scipio watched the Carthaginian veterans withdraw in perfect order, shields locked, formations intact, moving north toward the Pyrenees. He had won the battle. The question now was whether to pursue. His officers urged aggression. Destroy Hasdrubal's army completely, end the threat. But Scipio made a calculation that historians still debate. He let them go. His men were exhausted. The Carthaginians were retreating in good order, dangerous prey. Pursuing into unknown terrain could turn victory into catastrophe. Better to claim the battlefield, capture Hasdrubal's supplies in camp, and consolidate the psychological victory. It was the cautious decision. It was also the decision that allowed Hasdrubal to march 8,000 veterans to Italy, cross the Alps, and nearly reinforce Hannibal before being intercepted and killed at the Metaurus River. Some historians argue Scipio's restraint saved Rome by preserving his army for future campaigns. Others argue it nearly doomed Rome by letting Hasdrubal escape. The debate among Roman officers at noon was heated. Senior centurions argued that 8,000 exhausted legionaries could still destroy 8,000 retreating Carthaginians. Press the attack now while Roman momentum was overwhelming. Kill Hasdrubal. End the threat to Italy permanently. The officers weren't wrong strategically. They were thinking tactically. Scipio calculated differently. His legionaries had been fighting for 4 hours. They'd climbed steep slopes, fought in close combat, pursued fleeing enemies across a plateau. Casualty reports suggested 500 Roman dead, perhaps 1,500 wounded. That left approximately 6,000 effective soldiers. Hasdrubal commanded 8,000 fresh veterans who hadn't engaged at all. If Romans pursued into unfavorable terrain and the Carthaginians turned to fight, the exhaustion differential would become lethal. Here's what made Scipio's calculation brilliant and possibly catastrophic. He was thinking beyond Baecula. His mission wasn't just defeating Hasdrubal, it was destroying Carthage's ability to hold Iberia. Preserving his army meant he could campaign for another 2 years, capturing cities, turning tribes, dismantling the entire Carthaginian supply network. Losing his army chasing Hasdrubal meant Rome's Spanish campaign ended today, regardless of whether he killed Hasdrubal or not. The immediate spoils validated his restraint. Hasdrubal's camp contained supplies for 25,000 men, food, weapons, pay chests, siege equipment. Roman quartermasters calculated the captured treasury at over 400,000 denarii, enough to fund operations for 18 months. 6,000 Iberian prisoners were taken, most released immediately to spread word of Roman victory and mercy. But 11 months later, that decision would haunt Rome. Hasdrubal reached Italy with his 8,000 veterans plus Gallic reinforcements. For 6 terrifying months, 2 Barca armies operated in Italy simultaneously. If they'd linked up, Rome would have faced combined forces of nearly 80,000 men commanded by history's 2 greatest tactical minds. Only intercepted messengers and desperate forced marches prevented that nightmare. Scipio's choice at Baecula was either strategic genius or nearly fatal mercy. History never provided a clear answer, just consequences that almost destroyed everything. The Baecula plateau after the battle looked like the floor of an abattoir. Estimates vary, but historical sources suggest between 8,000 and 12,000 Iberian warriors died in the battle in pursuit. Another 6,000 were captured. Carthaginian losses among the retreating veterans were minimal, perhaps 500. Roman casualties were shockingly light. Accounts suggest fewer than 500 dead, perhaps 2,000 wounded. The mathematics of the battle were obscene. Scipio's exhausted, outnumbered force had inflicted casualties at a ratio of nearly 20-1. This wasn't battle. This was systematic dismantling of an army through pure tactical superiority. The survivors spent 2 days burning the dead. The smoke could be seen for 50 miles. Let those numbers sink in for a moment. 20 Iberian dead for every Roman killed. In ancient warfare, where victory typically meant casualty ratios of 2 or 3-1, this was statistically impossible. Yet it happened. The plateau bore witness. Bodies lay in heaps where formations had collapsed. Blood pooled in rock depressions. Scavenger birds appeared within hours, thousands of them, circling in spirals visible from the valley floor. Roman burial details worked through the afternoon and night. 500 legionaries required proper cremation with military honors. Their ashes would be collected, their names recorded, their families notified and compensated. The work was sacred, methodical, respectful. Iberian dead received different treatment. Mass funeral pyres built from timber stripped from Hasdrubal's abandoned camp. Bodies stacked like cordwood, oil poured over them. The pyres burned for 48 hours. Here's what ancient sources don't emphasize: the psychological cost of that cleanup. Roman soldiers who'd killed desperately in combat now handled corpses of men they'd slaughtered. Some were boys, 14 or 15 years old, tribal levies who'd never seen battle before Baecula. Their first battle was their last. Veterans hardened by years of campaigning reportedly wept while burning children they'd killed that morning. The captured Iberians presented Scipio with a strategic opportunity. 6,000 prisoners, mostly wounded, watching Romans cremate their dead comrades. Traditional Roman doctrine suggested enslavement. Sell them to merchants following the army. Profit from victory. Scipio ordered their release. All 6,000. No ransom, no conditions. Just a message. Tell your tribes what happened here. Tell them Rome defeated 25,000 with 8,000. Tell them we released you when we could have sold you. Tell them to choose their allies carefully. The prisoners limped away, carrying stories that would metastasize across Iberia faster than any military dispatch. Within weeks, tribal envoys would arrive at Roman camps bearing gifts and pledges of allegiance. Carthage's alliance network, built over decades, would collapse in months, because Scipio understood something Carthaginian generals never had. Fear maintains empires temporarily. Respect builds them permanently. And on that blood-soaked plateau, Rome had earned both. Hasdrubal reached the Pyrenees 6 weeks later with his 8,000 Carthaginian veterans and whatever Iberian cavalry had managed to keep up with the retreat. He had saved his core army. He had preserved the mission to reinforce Hannibal. But he had also abandoned 25,000 men and Carthage's entire strategic position in Iberia. News of Baecula spread across the peninsula faster than Hasdrubal could march. Iberian tribes that had fought for Carthage for 2 decades sent envoys to Scipio. The tribal leaders who had provided Carthage with warriors, supplies, and intelligence now offered those same resources to Rome. Carthage's other 2 armies in Iberia, under Hasdrubal, Gisco, and Mago, suddenly found themselves operating in hostile territory with unreliable allies. Baecula hadn't just destroyed an army. It had destroyed Carthage's alliance network. The tribal defections were catastrophic in scope and speed. Within 3 months of Bcula, 28 major Iberian tribes switched allegiance from Carthage to Rome. Think about what that represented. These weren't opportunistic bandits. These were established kingdoms that had provided Carthage with approximately 40,000 warriors annually, controlled critical mountain passes, and maintained the intelligence networks that warned of Roman movements. All gone. The Ilergetes, who'd supplied 5,000 cavalry to Carthaginian armies for 18 years, sent envoys offering those same horsemen to Scipio. The Edetani, who controlled the coastal routes between New Carthage and the Ebro River, opened their ports to Roman supply ships. The Turdetani, whose silver mines had funded Hannibal's Italian campaign, negotiated tribute agreements with Rome. Each defection wasn't just a loss of military resources. It was a strategic amputation. Here's what made the collapse so total. Carthage had ruled Iberia through a combination of military dominance and hostage diplomacy. They held hundreds of tribal nobles' children in New Carthage as insurance. Scipio had released them all after capturing the city. Those children returned home carrying stories of Roman mercy and Carthaginian abandonment. When Hasdrubal fled Baecula, leaving 20,000 Iberian allies to die, he validated every story those released hostages had told. Hasdrubal, Gisco, and Mago, commanding the remaining Carthaginian armies in southern Iberia, watched their recruitment networks dissolve. Tribes that had provided warriors for tribute now demanded gold for mercenary service. Intelligence dried up. Supply convoys required military escorts. Territory they'd controlled for decades became contested ground. By autumn 208 BC, Carthage's Spanish Empire had contracted from nearly the entire peninsula to a shrinking pocket in the far south. 2 Carthaginian armies, totaling perhaps 35,000 troops, isolated and increasingly desperate. Scipio commanded 8,000 legionaries, plus growing numbers of Iberian auxiliaries. The mathematics had inverted completely. But Hasdrubal Barca wasn't thinking about Iberia anymore. He was already crossing into Gaul, recruiting reinforcements, planning the Alpine crossing that would bring him to Italy and his brother. The question wasn't whether Carthage would lose Spain. It was whether losing Spain would cost them everything. Hasdrubal crossed the Alps in the spring of 207 BC with approximately 30,000 troops. The 8,000 Carthaginian veterans from Baecula, plus Gallic and Ligurian reinforcements, recruited along the way. He marched down the Italian peninsula toward his brother, toward the convergence that would crush Rome between two Barca armies. For 6 agonizing months, Rome faced its greatest strategic nightmare. 2 Carthaginian armies in Italy, 2 brilliant commanders, Hannibal in the south, Hasdrubal in the north. If they linked up, the war was over. But Roman intelligence intercepted Hasdrubal's messengers. The consul Gaius Claudius Nero force-marched an army north and intercepted Hasdrubal at the Metaurus River. The battle was brief and catastrophic. Hasdrubal died fighting in the front ranks. His army was annihilated. When Hannibal learned of his brother's death, sources say he finally understood that Carthage would lose the war. The Alpine crossing took 23 days. Hasdrubal lost 4,000 men to weather, disease, and tribal ambushes in the mountain passes. But he reached Italy with 26,000 effectives, plus cavalry and elephants. In Cisalpine Gaul, he recruited another 8,000 warriors from tribes that hated Rome. By June 207 BC, he commanded 34,000 troops marching south. Think about Rome's strategic position. Hannibal's army of approximately 40,000 occupied southern Italy. Hasdrubal's 34,000 approached from the north. Combined forces of 74,000 commanded by 2 brothers who'd studied warfare together, who understood each other's tactical language perfectly, who'd been planning this convergence for 6 years. No Roman army could match those numbers. The Senate prepared evacuation plans for the city itself. Here's what saved Rome. 4 Numidian cavalry scouts carrying messages from Hasdrubal to Hannibal, describing the rendezvous location. Roman patrols captured them near Tarentum. The messages revealed everything. Hasdrubal's position, his army strength, the planned meeting point, his timeline. Consul Gaius Claudius Nero made a decision that defined the war. He was facing Hannibal in southern Italy with approximately 30,000 legionaries. He selected 7,000 of his best troops and marched north, 250 miles in 7 days. His remaining forces maintained their positions, creating the illusion that the full Roman army still faced Hannibal. The deception held for exactly as long as it needed to. At the Metaurus River on June 22, 207 BC, combined Roman forces totaling 45,000 intercepted Hasdrubal's 34,000. The battle lasted 4 hours. Hasdrubal, seeing his army collapsing, charged into Roman lines deliberately seeking death. He found it. 10,000 Carthaginians died with him. Roman cavalry threw Hasdrubal's severed head into Hannibal's camp 3 days later. Hannibal, who hadn't seen his brother in 14 years, recognized him immediately. Ancient sources record that Hannibal stared at the head in silence, then spoke 4 words. Quote 3. Baecula's consequences had finally reached their conclusion. Baecula's true significance wasn't the battlefield victory. It was what the victory represented. For 6 years, Rome had fought Hannibal and Carthage using traditional Roman tactics. Frontal assaults, heavy infantry grinding, strength against strength. They had lost every time. Trebia, Lake Trasimene, Cannae. Hannibal had taught Rome that traditional tactics against superior commanders meant certain death. Scipio learned the lesson. At Baecula, he used speed instead of strength, maneuver instead of mass. He divided his forces, attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, and turned defensive terrain into a trap. He fought like Hannibal, and he won. 3 years later, Scipio would invade North Africa, threaten Carthage directly, and force Hannibal to abandon Italy. At Zama, using the same principles he'd refined at Baecula, Scipio would defeat Hannibal himself and end the Second Punic War. Rome survived the war because one 25-year-old commander recognized that learning from your enemy isn't weakness. It's evolution. Bcula was where Rome learned to win. The tactical innovations Scipio deployed at Baecula became Roman military doctrine for the next 2 centuries, dividing forces for simultaneous multi-directional assault, using speed and deception over brute strength. Psychological warfare through clemency and strategic messaging. These weren't Roman tactics. They were Carthaginian tactics wielded by a Roman commander smart enough to steal them. Here's what military historians emphasize. Before Scipio, Roman commanders treated tactics as fixed doctrine. The legion fought in certain formations using certain approaches because that's how Rome had always fought. Innovation was suspect. Tradition was sacred. Hannibal exploited that rigidity at Cannae, where 70,000 Romans died because they couldn't adapt to encirclement tactics they'd never trained against. Scipio understood that survival demanded adaptation. At Baecula, 8,000 Romans defeated 25,000 Carthaginians using tactics that would have been unthinkable to his father's generation. Dividing an inferior force? Heresy. Attacking uphill from 3 directions simultaneously? Madness. Releasing 6,000 prisoners to spread propaganda? Weakness. Yet each quote 4 contributed to total victory. The casualty mathematics proved the method. 20 Carthaginian deaths per Roman killed. That ratio didn't result from superior weapons or better soldiers. It resulted from superior thinking. Scipio had studied his enemy, understood how they fought, then used their own methods against them with devastating efficiency. 3 years after Baecula, in 204 BC, Scipio invaded North Africa with the army he'd forged in Iberia. Carthage, facing existential threat, recalled Hannibal from Italy after 15 years. The 2 greatest commanders of the age met at Zama in 202 BC. Scipio deployed the same tactical principles he'd mastered at Baecula. Hannibal, fighting with inferior cavalry and unreliable infantry, lost his first and only major battle. The Second Punic War ended with Carthage's unconditional surrender. Rome emerged as the Mediterranean's dominant power. And it happened because one commander recognized a fundamental truth that empires forget at their peril. The side that learns fastest survives longest. Bcula was Rome's classroom. Hannibal was the teacher. And Scipio proved to be history's most dangerous student.